Jim Martin trying another field goal. It's a fake. Rote is running with the ball. He throws a pass, and it's going to be for a touchdown. Fake field goal.
See this play right here? Arguably one of the gutsiest calls in the history of an NFL title game. In the 1957 NFL Championship, the Detroit Lions led 17-7 against the Cleveland Browns in the second quarter. Detroit jumped out to a 17-0 lead in the first quarter, though the Browns cut the deficit to 10 points in the second off of a 29-yard touchdown run by one of the greatest to ever do it, Jim Brown. Detroit was now lining up for a 26-yard field goal. Jim Martin is lining up for the kick. He hit from 31 yards earlier in the game, and he's hit on 50% of his kicks this season, which isn't great but admittedly isn't terrible for being 1957. And instead, it's a fake. Quarterback and holder Tobin Rote picks the football up and throws it to Steve Junker for a 26-yard score to make it a 24-7 ballgame. It's a gutsy play. If it fails, Cleveland's got momentum on their side, and who knows what happens from that point on. But it wound up working. And what makes this play incredible was that it wasn't supposed to happen. This was a player defying the orders of his coach. Usually, that doesn't end well. But in this instance, Tobin Rote's disobedience toward head coach George Wilson paid off big time. Allow me to explain. Before I do that though, there's two important pieces of context to look at. Number one, this Lions team was not the easiest to control. This was not an obedient Lions team or an easily coachable team. It was so bad, in fact, that head coach Buddy Parker, who won the title with the Lions in 1952 and 53, went 9-3 in 1956 and won over 67% of his games in his 6 seasons with Detroit, resigned just before the start of the 1957 season to take a job with the Steelers, because he said he couldn't handle the team. At a team banquet just before the start of the season, he announced his resignation, calling this version of the Lions the worst team he'd ever seen. And number two, you might be wondering why Tobin Rote is playing and not Bobby Layne, since the infamous curse of Bobby Layne didn't happen until 1958. Well, Layne was on the roster in 1957 and was the team's starting quarterback for most of the season. Admittedly, 1957 was not his finest year. He threw 6 touchdowns and 12 interceptions in his 11 games and 7 starts. However, in a regular season game against the Browns just a few weeks prior on December 8th, he broke his ankle, which meant that the backup Tobin Rote, who was acquired at the start of the season in a trade with Green Bay, was thrust into the position. So that takes us to this play. Head coach George Wilson called for a field goal to be called. Play it safe, don't give the Browns too much momentum, and make it a 13-point game. But in the huddle, some players thought they should go for it and go for broke. So against the coach's orders, Rote called the fake field goal. It ended up working out big time. The play resulted in a touchdown, it gave Detroit a 3-possession lead, and they wound up winning the game by a convincing scoreline of 59-14. After the game, Rote was asked what would have happened if the play had failed, to which he jokingly told the reporter not to mention that because he'd be in the doghouse. What did Coach Wilson think of the play? Well, when you win the championship, it's tough to criticize a play that actually works. He said that Rote called the play, and it was just fine with him the way it worked out. This fake field goal was one of the gutsiest and forgotten plays in the history of NFL championship games. And it was all because a backup quarterback, seemingly with nothing to lose, decided to disobey his coach's orders.